are passing through the most difficult phases in our lives as the global pandemic COVID-19 has gripped the entire world, spreading across the globe, threatening human existence. Almost every country has implemented lockdown and closed its borders. It has affected human health, education, environment, agriculture, industry, business, tourism, transportation. It has caused huge losses to the socio-economic development throughout the world. Economy of our entire nation came to a standstill with the lockdown, following which the world witnessed a violent clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers in June 2020 along the line of actual control in the eastern Ladakh Galwan Valley. This latest border standoff has aggravated anti-China sentiments in India to a record high. Faced with an assertive neighbor and multiple occasions of confrontation in recent years, India is scrambling for an effective response. As of now, the focus is on economically damaging China by boycotting its products and regulating incoming Chinese investments in the economy. Moves to boycott Chinese goods and restrict Chinese capital in India are driven by some fundamental concerns. These include safeguarding national security by reducing Chinese financial and functional presence in strategic sectors. Boycott Chinese products within quotes is a slogan used by internet campaigns that advocate a boycott of products made in China. Commonly cited reasons for the boycott include the alleged low quality of products, human rights issues, territorial conflicts involving China, and more recently, the government's alleged mismanagement of the COVID pandemic situation. The Indian government hasn't explicitly announced a boycott, but by all accounts, states and public sector companies have been reportedly asked to desist from issuing new contracts to Chinese companies. CAIT, or the Confederation of the All India Traders, realizes that replacing Chinese-made products with domestically made ones will be a challenge. Therefore, it wants to use psychological pressure and patriotism to get consumers to shun goods made in China. India has faced the COVID-19 situation with fortitude and a spirit of self-reliance. The clarion call given by the Honorable Prime Minister to use these trying times to become Atma-Nirbhar or self-reliant has been very well received to enable the resurgence of the Indian economy. But still, there remain some persistent burning questions. Will not imposing stringent import measures jeopardize Indian economy? Will Indian industries be benefited through these decisions? Will it ultimately facilitate towards Atma-Nirbhar Bharat? Ad hoc economic actions like boycotts won't affect China. For eroding China's economic influence, India must work with other countries. It has damaged such prospects by quitting trade pacts and pushing economic nationalism. Is self-reliance the answer? Bilateral economic relations cannot be viewed in a blinkered fashion, while imports may be the visible end. With their ability to evoke emotional patriotic responses, these issues have to be viewed holistically. We are deeply honored to have two eminent speakers, scholars with us, who will be throwing light and sharing their valued opinion on these very important, relevant topic. I do expect this webinar to be an extremely enriching and fruitful one, and I'm sure on behalf of college, on everybody concerned with this webinar, that you scholars are going to do full justice to this very important topic. Thank you once again. Thank you all the audience. Stay safe. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, madam, for your wonderful inaugural address. Now I request our principal ma'am to give your welcome speech. Hello,
Good
madam.
afternoon. Hello.
Uh,
Hello. I am
yes,
audible.
yes, yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Respected resource person, Professor Sugato Marji, the first distinguished professor in Department of Economics and Trade Policies in Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and our ex-Vice Chancellor of University of Calcutta, respected resource person, Professor Rajat Acharya, professor in Department of Economics and Director of Human Resource Development Center, Dadapur University, respected teachers from different universities and colleges, and other virtual audience joined in this webinar. It is a privilege to extend my sincerest welcome to each one of you to the webinar on boycott Chinese products, prospects and challenges in India. Professor Sugato Marjit is a very eminent professor and researcher in economics and inspired innumerable number of students, including me, to do theoretical research work in the field of economics. For that, I remain very much grateful to you, sir. Today, he will devote some of his precious time to deliver a valuable speech on the topic. On behalf of Srirampur Girls College, I convey my heartfelt gratitude and thanks to you, sir. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Rajat Acharya, my research guide in PhD and a very eminent professor devoting his valuable time to deliver his speech in this webinar platform. On behalf of Srirampur Girls College, I express my sincere thanks to you, sir. China has emerged as one of the most important economic powers in the world in last 15-20 years, and that has been possible by exporting different kinds of final products, raw materials, capital goods throughout the world at competitive price, and also by participating in foreign direct investment in those countries. At present, India remains far behind of China, not only in respect of growth rate in per capita national income, but also in different human development indices, social and infrastructure development, etc. China's export earning from India is 4 times higher than that India earns from China. There is a lot of argument how it has been possible by China, why India has remained far behind. I think today's discussion may focus some insights into the matter. After outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, our Honorable Prime Minister has called for Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhijan. This self-reliant Indian mission is announced to boost up indigenous production in order to reduce India's dependence on exports in future. Following the Galwan Valley incident, Swadesh Jagran Month raised slogan Boycott China. India government has banned 59 Chinese apps in India and taken other measures to check imports from China and its FDI participation. Now people from different corners are very much worried about the future of Indo-China trade relation. Will the growth rate of Indian industries will be increased in future? Whether employment opportunities be increased? What will be the impact on general people? I hope that Our resource person will focus insights into the matter and express their expert opinion on it. We all are eagerly waiting to hear from both of you, sir. I hope a very fruitful and enlightening discussion in this webinar, which will enrich our virtual audience. I wish a grand success of this seminar. At present, human civilization is under threat due to outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. Status quo prevails in almost every domain of human activities. But it is our great belief that we can overcome this disaster by forwarding our cooperation and love for each other. At last, I wish good health with sound mind for all of us in this COVID pandemic situation. Thank you to all of you for joining in this webinar. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, madam, for your excellent welcome speech. Uh, Now, good afternoon. Myself, Dr. Uttam Haldar, HOD Department of Economics, Srirampur Girls College, feeling honored to welcome honorable speakers and all the participants in the national webinar organized by the Department of Economics, Srirampur Girls College on the most relevant and burning topics of the present day, titled Boycott Chinese Products, Prospects and Challenges in India. Participants, today we have a privilege that we are with two eminent economists, exceptional speakers, and distinguished academicians, Professor Subrata Marchit and Professor Rajat Acharya. In the first session, the lecture will be delivered by Professor Subrata Marchit. After that, in the second session, the lecture will be given by Professor Rajat Acharya. Both of them are well known to all of us, and we are eager to listen their valuable lecture. But as a convention, I am glad to present a brief introduction of their academic excellence. Subrata Marchit is the first distinguished professor, Department of Economics and Trade Policy, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. He was the RBI professor of Industrial Economics and the director at the Center for Studies in Social Science, Calcutta. He was first Sukhma Chakraborty professor at the Center for Economics Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He was former vice chancellor of University of Calcutta. He held visiting professional position at the University of Bonn, Berlin, Copenhagen, Cornell, Erasmus, Monash, Munich, Constance, Paris, Sydney, New South Wales, Queensland, Penn State, Rochester, Australian National University, etc. He has been a visiting scholar at the IMF and Federal Reserve Bank, St. Louis, USA, among the other places. He has published more than 150 research papers in journals of international reputation. Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Springer Nature have published his books and edited volumes. He is the editor of the South Asian Journal of Macroeconomic and Public Finance. He received the Mahalanobis Gold Medal of the Indian Econometric Society in 2002, the most coveted award for economists in India, and the V.K. R.V. Rao National Prize as a young social scientist in 2003, among very few to receive both awards. In 2018, he was nominated as the Distinguished Visiting Fellow from Asia at the Queen Mary University of London. Apart from academician, Professor Subrata Marchit has another identity. He is a noted musician. He is actually a khayal singer. He also composes music for the theatre and television. In 1995, his work in the theatre earned him the West Bengal State Academy Award for Best Musical Score. Now, Professor Rajat Acharya. Rajat Acharya is the Professor of Economics of Jadavpur University and the Director, UGC Human Resource Development Center, Jadavpur University. He was the Dean, Faculty of Arts, Jadavpur University. He held visiting professional positions at different foreign universities such as Utrecht School of Economics, the Netherlands, University of Kent at Canterbury, UK, University of Rochester, New York, etc. He got several awards at national and international level. national and international level, like International Trade Research Awards of the Export India, Global Development Network, Washington DC in 2003 for best research on globalization, inequity, and poverty. Mohanlal's Memorial Medal Award of the Econometric Society of India in 2006. He got Shikkha Ratna, the best teacher award at university level, Government of West Bengal in 2016. He has published more than 110 research papers in Journal of International Equity. Reputed international publishers has published his books and audited volumes. He is the editor of the journal Trade and Development Review and associate editor of Macroeconomic Annuals. He guided many PhD and MPhil scholars. He successfully completed 10 projects. Now, it is a great pleasure to me to announce that our principal madam, Dr. Suma Rai, will be the chairperson for both the lecture session. Over to our respected principal ma'am for the remaining part of the webinar. Madam, please.
Sir, I request you, sir, Professor Sugato Marjit, to start his presentation speech, and I request all of you to unmute your microphone and fully concentrate on the speeches of Professor Sugato Marjit. Please start, sir.
Okay. Uh, good afternoon, everyone. I guess you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Of course, it's a great pleasure for me to be invited to your webinar today, and on a topic which is, of course, very close to the heart of almost everyone who's little interested in India-China relations. Of course, I should also thank Rajat for sharing this stage with me. As Shoma has said that Shoma is my student, so is Rajat. And it is a pleasure to share the stage with Rajat, who himself, as you know, is one of our outstanding teachers in the profession and a very, very learned trade economist. So I would hope that actually Rajat would do a much better job than me. So what I'm going to do is actually give you my views, of course, my views on the subject. But as someone who has been teaching international trade for over 35 years now, I guess I feel that I should try to clear up certain misconceptions that affect the debate of India-China trade relations. So let me start with the fact that after China and India got engaged in the border skirmish on the northern part of India, there has been a slogan of boycott China or boycott Chinese goods. You see, of course, this has a profound nationalist sentiment behind it, about which, as an economist, I cannot make any judgment. But one point that I should emphasize that that China, being India's either second or third largest international business partner, China running an average trade surplus with India over the last, I would say, the decade, but on average $45 billion, which is basically the deficit turns out to be 50,000 crores or something like that. So this issue of actually huge trade deficit tells you that we are heavily dependent on China for goods. I do not know how much of services, but definitely for goods. And services, very interestingly, uh, the trade and service account, which is reflected in the current account, is essentially the income of China from factor payments or factor performance in India, which turns out to be the interest uh, that Chinese companies earn by investing in now almost, I do not know, maybe 50 leading companies in India, the virtual companies, the apps, in which China has made huge amount of investment. So if you take if you calculate the percentage of return on this investment, that also would constitute a huge amount of inflow from India into China. So in one respect, I would, it's sort of an intelligent move on the part of the government, actually to, in a sense, to uh, sort of penalize the companies which are engaged in virtual transactions rather than real transactions, because that's going to affect the interest earning of these investors, which is not the same as, the bulk pharmaceutical raw materials that we import from China. This is very important, that what kind of restrictions on Chinese trade from a very short run, number one, and also from a very political perspective, politically correct perspective of nationalistic emotions, and which actually affects the Chinese little more than the Indians, is actually to attempt to curb some of these activities in terms of this restriction of investments in apps, like all these there are Chinese holding companies which have invested huge amount in anything that we use today in terms of home delivery of services, in terms of our transportation needs for services, anything that go by using the apps. China has a role to play, and you can't forget about how Paytm became very popular right after the demonetization was announced. Now, the misconception that flies around is about, some people might say, while criticizing the move of India in terms of restricting Chinese trade in goods, that China gives us things which are cheap, which Indian people can afford better, and therefore it is not really very logical to stop those, because that's going to increase the cost structure that is prevailing in the country, and rising prices will affect a large number of people. So this is the basic reason that trade economists or the trade professors, when they teach their students, they say that restricting imports have a welfare cost, because these welfare costs are in form of more expensive import goods. And because you cannot get these goods cheaper within the country, you are forced to import it at a lower price. And therefore, when I curb those imports, or I put a tax on these imports, I am actually creating disadvantage for the citizens, the residents. Fair enough, because that's how the comparative advantage argument uh, determines the pattern of trade. It can be due to differences in technology. It can be due to differences in factor prices. It can be due to differences in productivity, that China is doing better than India in many goods. Otherwise, why I'm going to buy so much or so many goods from China and paying so much price? Now, apparently, this logic is cannot be violated. But the problem here is that if you dig deeper into this issue, in our trade theory, we never say, for example, what would have happened if India wanted to produce these goods? Or we don't say that why China having higher wage than India, China having much higher per capita income than India, that China can supply India with lots of labor intensive, with lots with lots of labor intensive goods. Our theory does not say that, because if your wages are lower than mine, then you have an advantage of supplying me with labor intensive goods. So what is going wrong in the Indian side, that we have poorer workers, but we cannot produce and supply the same labor intensive good in our country? So therefore, first is that boycotting Chinese goods is not always feasible. Take, for example, the pharmaceutical machineries. Any machines that China sells to us, pharmaceutical raw materials, which actually help us to produce cheaper drugs. So we cannot afford to overnight restrict these imports. But at the same time, there are hundreds of examples that which say that at one time those goods were produced in India. For example, the wall clock. The clock that I think every Bengali has a wall clock, used to have one wall clock. And this wall clock used to be produced in India. And in fact, there is a place in Gujarat which used to produce a large number of these wall clocks. But over time, the Chinese started producing all the wall clocks. And these producing companies became trading companies. So they would buy cheap from China and sell dear in India. See, very interestingly, the tussle between manufacturing and trading, which is the irony and the tragic consequence of India's industrialization, tells you that India, over the last, I don't know, maybe 4 decades, it's not really an issue to blame the current government, because I think the Congress government for a long number of years has not really cared about this, that China very slowly and steadily entered many labor intensive ventures. How could they do it? And we gave in. The only thing we did, we found that, okay, if the manufacturing cost in China are lower, let me not do manufacturing. Let me go to China, buy this good at a cheaper price, come and sell it in India. That's my profit. So the whole country of manufacturers became a country of traders. So the problem of industrialization in India, which shows very low share of manufacturing to GDP compared to China for a considerable length of time, is something that we should worry about. And as I have said somewhere else, that it is not about China encroaching the border areas of India, but China already not only encroached, it has invaded, and it has actually completely, I would say, completely displaced the economic border areas of our country. So China has entered through the economic borders, the porous borders, because we failed to do manufacturing. And interestingly, India's share of almost less than 30% to GDP as the manufacturing, if you compare with China's almost 50% to GDP for considerable length of time, then that is not very difficult to explain, that why China is running a trade surplus of that huge amount. So the fundamental point is not really of boycotting Chinese goods. The fundamental point is our inability to produce certain things which China can produce and we cannot. Like, as I have said somewhere else, about the synthetic Banarasi saris. If you go to Uttar Pradesh, in the major areas of where you can get Banarasi saris, people go ecstatic about Chinese Banarasi saris because they are cheap. And the local producers are actually have become traders who are selling these Chinese Banarasi saris to local, to the population. All the images of gods and goddesses that are sold in India. People say that China has always produced and supplied pretty low quality goods. I think it's okay, because if there is demand for low quality goods, Chinese are going to produce low quality goods. In fact, China is one country, as some people told me where they do business, that there are a series of machines or technologies or whatever, which each of which produces a particular quality of the same good. So if you want a good which is 50 rupees per piece, Chinese has technology. If you want a good which is 60 rupees per piece, 100 rupees per piece, it has a technology. You want 30 rupees per piece, it has a technology. Now, you see, the question is, we are also buying and selling goods of various qualities for produced by Indians for Indian markets. But why they are not becoming globally competitive? Why China is grabbing this market? We have to ask these questions to us ourselves. So let me try to give you some reasons which I don't know really, because I'm not a businessman, but I have, because of the interest in this subject, I have been discussing this with a lot of businessmen in Mumbai and Delhi and local areas. And the issue is, we try to look at how you can decompose a cost of a common good between India and China, and try to see where in that supply value chain we are being sort of sidelined by China. I'll give you a story, which is not a story. Long ago, Chinese producers were taken to court of law by the American producers because China was to violate the anti-dumping laws. That is, China would be producing a good and selling it in their market, let's say at $50, and they will sell the same good at $30 in US market. So United States says that this is dumping and I won't allow you to sell. The Chinese would have law offices in many cities of US, and they will fight the US producers. Then the US court would ask, what is the true price of this good? Now this I'm talking about at least 25, 30 years ago. And nobody would believe Chinese estimate, because Chinese statistics, as everybody would say, is all cooked up. In fact, even today, if you want to work with Chinese data from the Chinese government, many people will not trust it. This is because of the fact that China is not a democracy, and China is a different kind of a political system, and information and data can be manipulated and so on and so forth. I do not know the real story, but at that time, the United States court asked that what would be a benchmark price that we can trust, and everybody sets price in India. So this kind of difference that India actually enjoyed at that time, which is probably it is enjoying now, is the idea that India has much of a more of an open market, open information system.
Sir, I just want to say that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, I think there was some comments, so I could not hear. But anyway, so the issue is that the Chinese cost of production, when you try to estimate that might contain many suppressed subsidies, many invisible subsidies that the Chinese government gives, many favors that the Chinese government gives, which are not really tangible or quantifiable. If you discuss with the producers, with the acquirers of these products for India, they will give you better story. The point is that the Chinese transportation system infrastructure ability, the logistics, as we call it, the logistics, the way they have computerized the consignment deliveries and so on, the ports, the delivery points, these are fantastic because of Chinese investment in infrastructure. China has invested at a rate which India can never match. China invested at a rate of more than 40-45%, when India could not reach even 30%. So Chinese rate of investment is amazing. And India did not invest much in a product which gave India a lot of benefits, that is the service sector. So India's supremacy in service sector till today is very much recognized in the entire world. Software services, IT related services, virtual trades, and so on. And if you look at the structural differences in that, in a very interesting article that came out in 2005 or 6. You can update that to 2020. Structurally, there has not been much of a change. I think 2005 or 6, or maybe a little later, uh, in Journal of Economic Perspectives. This was about the Chinese and Indian comparison of different things: their growth, their balance of payments, their trade, their sectoral composition of output, and so on. And you will find, again, one story that we never, or one information that we never divulged for due to some reason. But when India says that make in India is essential because our honorable Prime Minister was giving the right slogans, given that the whole world knows what is made in China. What does made in China imply? So make in India, if you really look at that slogan, make in India is essentially increasing the manufacturing to GDP ratio. Because if you produce more in India, your manufacturing to GDP ratio is going to go up. So, the problem is properly uh, realized by the government. I cannot deny that fact, that we can understand that manufacturing is an issue and the government cannot understand. But interestingly, let me give you a statistic which I think is important. India invested at much lower rate than China over the last, I don't know, 20 years, 15, 20, 30 years. Rate of investment is much lower in India than in China. However, over the last couple of decades, Indian growth rate has been quite good. India's growth rate was comparable to China's. So how come we are investing at much smaller rate, but our growth rate was neck to neck with respect to China, at least in the post-reform period for about 15 to 20 years? And only the kind of an economist who has done basic growth theory would tell you that India must be a more productive nation than China, because the incremental capital output ratio in India must be lower than China. That is, India is not investing at that rate. Therefore, output per incremental capital must be higher in India, which is true. So how come India becoming such a productive nation, but India has such a low manufacturing to GDP, and India needs a Make in India slogan, and India is doing so badly with China? The simple argument is because all the productivity growth has gone into the service sector. So when you take the aggregate figure, then the service sector becomes a very important part of GDP, and that mesmerizes the entire statistics. So if you actually go by sectoral decomposition, you will find that, as far as my knowledge goes, manufacturing productivity and agricultural productivity both are lower than China. So the question therefore is how to increase that productivity. Let me come back, and I think I should ask Shoma about how long do I have without making Rajat angry.
45 minutes.
So
How
it is
long?
how long?
Uh,
How extra? So
uh,
basically, so
up to 4 p.m.
okay, fine. Thank you. Yes, I have plenty of time to finish. So uh, the issue that comes with the Chinese and Indian trade, that we cannot compare when we compare with other countries. For example, over the last few years, India's trade deficit with the other countries has been declining, and India's trade deficit with China was increasing. Now, there is nothing wrong here, because you have to agree that I shall be exporting more to some countries and exporting less to some countries. I would be importing more from some countries and importing less from some countries. So overall, my trade deficit has to be manageable. So it cannot be the case that I just pick on a country called A and said, no, I'm going to have a trade deficit, which is, I should not have that much of trade deficit with A, but I can afford to have a lot of trade deficit with B. Now that, there is no textbook of economics would actually guide you towards that. But there is a reason that why India-China relation is sensitive. Because China not only is a border country, but China also has a huge military power. China has a huge stretch of border and India and China had border clashes, a war, and so on. So people can say that, okay, that if you do not control them on the trade front, they would be more forceful on the border front. Actually, this, I first thought that China, difficult for China, us to handle China. But you see, China is a big businessman. He's one of the fantastic business, as we say, businessman, businesswoman. It's a business country of the world. So it understands that if all its investors start losing money in India because of their investment in different kind of apps, then it is better to do something that will not annoy India to some extent. So the question, therefore, being dependent also has its advantage, because you can cut back your imports, you can cut back the investments or the benefits from investment to some effect. And of course, it is almost like, which in Bengali language we should say, nijer nak kete porer jatra bhango, but still it has an impact on your partner country. So I think the policies that India will choose so far as trade with China is concerned have to be very different from the policies that India will choose European Union, for example. So I believe that there is no shortcut in dealing with China, because if you cannot compete with China in the technology front, if you cannot compete with China in terms of the costs of production of workers, if you cannot compete with China in terms of infrastructure, of supply chain logistics, if airport and so on, you cannot compete with China. That's period. And you have to be dependent on China. And as the government realizes that boycotting all goods will not help, because your pharmaceuticals, your equipments, different kinds of machineries, and there are thousands and thousands of traders who are surviving because you are importing things from China. I import something, at $10 and send in India at, let's say, $15. I get $2. Who get those $3? The extra $3 goes to the laborers, the entrepreneurs who are the middlemen, and therefore and then there are goods and services which are intermediate goods which go into the production processes. So all those things would have a bad cascading effects. Therefore, it is very important, without sort of dilly-dallying with what I'm trying to say, we can cut to the chase and argue that 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 the long-term problem or medium to long-term solution has to do with the fact that government of India has to understand that there has to be research or analysis as to the products which apparently seems we can produce, but why we have been importing it from China. Where does government can intervene to give some advantage to the local workers, to the local entrepreneurs, to local whoever, who instead of getting it from China will start producing in India. So that will tell us that how we can make the rate of return from investment as an entrepreneur higher than the rate of return of investment as a trader. Now that means that you have to promote entrepreneurship, the MSMEs and so on and so forth, but with a target. It's not really that it's a haphazard, growth and so on, or a haphazard choice of allocation of resources. But with a target, if you can do that, is to choose, let's say, 100, sort of closest, the products with closest proximities. That is where a little intervention may actually make a difference, so that India can really go all out to make something in India, particularly with respect to China. And that, without that, I think it is not very healthy. It is not that we are negating or denying laws of economics, but it's not healthy. It's not healthy to produce the same goods which are produced by a labor abundant country. It's not Europe or US or Japan. And then we are running huge trade deficit with them. So there are big question marks what is going to happen in future. But I believe we are at a crossroad, and the government of India has a great opportunity now. And I think they have acted well by at least trying to cut back these apps to some extent, but I don't think they can do it for is a part of the service sector, and India thrives on service sector. So with this COVID thing, killing us, killing everybody, but it is killing us also as individuals, as communities, as everyone. Killing in the sense that people are leading imprisoned life, and it is creating huge problem. Today, Paul Krugman has a paper, has an article in the New York Times in which he says that America has drunk away the children's education, which means that they have asked the pubs and the bars to be open, but the schools to remain closed. So the question is that India, in spite of we are having so much of difficulties, and for example, with online education, how many apps you are going to control and how many apps you are going to tax, in which China is making a lot of investment, providing liquidity, making the costs cheaper. How you can do that for long? So one has to think deep and be very pragmatic as to how to proceed in this situation. I think it's doable. It is not the case that we should go all out and boycott everything from China. There has to be a balance between the military strategies, the economic strategies, the foreign diplomacy, and so on, that we understand. But we cannot wait any longer. Make in India cannot only be a slogan. And we have to have a very aggressive, almost military-like attitude towards manufacturing to make this country, I believe the target would be like, maybe if it is 25, 26%, the target should be at least 33, 34% of GDP in the next 10 years or so. There are targets in front of you, and you have to set the target properly and take policies properly. Without manufacturing growth and manufacturing share in GDP, I don't think that over the longer run, India can have even a partial comparative advantage in some set of goods that they are importing from China. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I think Rajat is now going to present, and afterwards, if you have any questions on my presentation, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, sir, for your valuable speech. We think we have been very much enriched and know lots of you in India-China trade relation. I convey my sincere thanks to you, sir. Now, Professor Rajat Acharya, please start your valuable speech, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's really a privilege to share the virtual stage with Shugotoda as well. Shugotoda was my supervisor, and it is always very difficult to speak after Shugotoda because he speaks so well and covered such a wide spectrum of things. But still, I will try, and I shall present you some data on this. So I will be sharing some PPT. But let me start with thanking Srirampur College, Department of Economics, and also Principal Dr. Soma Roy, who incidentally was my one of my PhD student. But anyway, so let me try with sharing my PPT. Just a minute. So. Yeah, can you see this? Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, fine.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I have titled my lecture broadly as Indo-China Trade Relations, Nature Dimensions and Challenges. So let me start with some introductory remarks, and of course, what I'll be saying, there will be some overlaps with what Professor Sugoto Martin had said, but I'll be echoing some of his remarks which he has already made. So actually, the economic ties with China, be it trade or Chinese FDI, all have been under scanner and review after the Galwan and LAC conflict. A series of events, retaliatory in nature, have unfolded since then. Though there has been regarding officially restricting imports from China through tariff and non-tariff barriers, the idea of self-reliance has been floated by our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Consignments of imports from China have been subjected to stricter scrutiny at airports and seaports by customs officials. Safeguards have been taken against FDI from China in strategic sectors, with the government of India advising BSNL to cancel tender for 4G telecom network upgrading. 59 apps have been banned, which have direct or indirect involvement of China. And to top up all these, public sentiments are running high, resulting in a call in the social media to boycott the Chinese products. At this backdrop, in this lecture, I shall talk about the following points. First, I will have a brief discussion on nature and dimension of trade relations with China, emergence of China as the major source country for India's imports, ramifications of boycotting Chinese goods, and Chinese investments.
Hello.
Ramification of boycotting Chinese goods and prohibiting Chinese investment in strategic sectors. Unprecedented economic dependence on China in recent times and the way ahead. But before that, as Shubhata was also telling, I would like to have a very brief discussion on the basic principles of trade between nations. It is well known that arbitrage, and she has studied here, is the basic force behind most of the trade. And arbitrage is possible by price differences across countries. Under unregulated market trade, goods are imported from not just the cheaper source country, but from the cheapest source country. For example, India will be importing textiles from China if its cheapest source, that is, if China sells textiles cheaper than Bangladesh or its other competitors.
Rajat, you have sound problem. Sorry.
Hello.
Rajat, you have sound problem.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
আপনারা ক্লিয়ার স্যারটা ক্লিয়ার হচ্ছে না
Hello. Hello. Hello.
হ্যালো
এই উত্তম আমার সাউন্ড ক্লিয়ার আছে?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ আপনার ক্লিয়ার আছে স্যারটা শোনা যাচ্ছে না
দেবগানটি অফ করেছো মনে হচ্ছে স্যারের সাউন্ডটা।
না
হ্যালো হ্যালো
দেববন্ধী ও না
হ্যালো
দেববন্ধী হ্যালো
দেবগা আচ্ছা 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 ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে
প্লিজ ওয়েট
এই সবগুলো আনমিউট করে রাখো। হ্যালো হ্যালো
আপনার শোনা যাচ্ছে স্যার জয়েন করবো
ছবিটা দে,
দেখতে হবে তোমাকে।
হ্যাঁ তা দেখো।
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? শুনতে পাচ্ছ?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Sir,
fine,
now
fine.
it is
Okay.
clear now.
No, there was a network problem. Okay,
Okay.
Okay.
okay. So now can you see this, right? You can see this?
Hello. Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So as I was saying that, for example, India will be importing textiles from China if it is the cheapest source. That is, China sells textiles cheaper than Bangladesh or its other competitors. There are two caveats though. One is the transport cost. Goods may be imported from China even when it is not the cheapest source if transporting goods from there is lower than from other competing source countries. There is another caveat, which is variety and quality. Even if prices are higher in a particular source country, goods may be imported from there if those are of higher qualities or are of different varieties compared to a cheaper source country. So basically, in general, under unregulated market-driven trade, prices and quality of goods in China and cost of transporting goods from there compared to other source countries determine which goods will be imported from China. And similar will be the case for goods exported by India to China. And this is important to keep in mind. Of course, trade policies like tariffs, non-tariff barriers, bilateral or regional trading agreements, and the like also influence in a large way the economic and trade relations between the countries. A free trade area agreement between India and the USA will divert imports by India from a cheaper source country to the United States. And this was first pointed out by Jacob Weiner in his 1950 book, which he termed as trade diversion effect. Now, given this perspective, let me just briefly discuss on the nature and dimension of trade relations with China. And I shall confine myself only with the merchandise trade. Of course, the service trade, India is having a surplus with China in service trade, but it is the merchandise trade and the manufacturing trade in particular, which is giving a lot of trouble between a lot of trouble to India as far as the trade relationship with China is concerned. So if we look at the aggregate trade pattern, then one asymmetry is very startling. If we look at the structure of India's aggregate exports to China, we can observe that less than 50% of our exports to China is constituted by manufacturing. These blue segments of the vertical bars are the manufacturing goods being exported, and the other brown shaded vertical segments are the non-manufacturing. Compared to China, if we look at the merchandise export structure of China to India, it is all manufacturing exports. Almost 95% of its merchandise exports to India constituted by or comprised of manufacturing goods. Now, and there has been a steep and steady rise in Chinese exports. Also, as Shubhata had pointed out, the India's trade deficit with China, the bilateral trade deficit, has been persistent and growing like anything. And in 2018, it stood at 60 billion US dollars. The overall and manufacturing trade balance, if we look at that, they have a similar trend. The only point to make is that the manufacturing trade deficit for India was larger than overall trade deficit during the 9-year period, 2005 to 2013. Now let me go to the composition of imports from China. If we look at the manufacturing imports at a very aggregate level, one-digit level, then it is evident that the entire manufacturing imports that come from China is comprised of two categories: machinery and transport equipment and chemicals. Both have grown very fast. These blue segments indicate the chemicals, and the brown segments indicate the machinery and transport equipment. Now, both have grown very fast, but machinery and transport equipment have outpaced chemicals. resulting in a falling share of chemicals. If we look at the 1995 decomposition, then chemical products had a share of 55% in Chinese imports, of Chinese exports, whereas machinery and transport equipment stood at 22%. But in 2018, the chemical products had a share of 22%, and machinery and transport equipment had a share of 57%. Just the shares got reversed over this period of almost 23, 24 years. Now, I will next focus on the two aspects, the machinery and transport equipment, composition of that, and composition of chemicals. If we look at the composition of chemicals, the largest share are these brown segments, which are the organic chemicals, followed by import of medicines and pharmaceutical products from China. So organic chemicals constitute the largest share of import of chemicals, which is roughly around 40%, and share of medicine and pharmaceutical products declined from 25% in 1995 to 10% in 2018. All these data are taken from UNCTAD Handbook of Trade Statistics 2019. Okay, so that's the situation. As far as machinery and transport equipment is concerned, this is comprised mainly of these orange segments, which are telecommunication and sound recording apparatus, followed by electrical machinery, these ones, and the yellow ones are the office machines and automatic data processing machines. So the share of telecommunication and sound recording apparatus had been around 30 to 40% of imports from China as far as the machinery and transport equipments are concerned. And these three categories have made up 60 to 70% of imports of machinery and transport equipment in the last 3-4 years. But most surprising and most important is the share of parts and components for electrical and electronic goods in imports of machinery and transport equipment, which is a huge amount over the years, during the period 1995 to 2018. More or less 40% of our imports of machinery and transport equipment have been comprised of parts and components for electrical and electronic goods. So given this, now let me very briefly discuss how China has emerged as a major supplier or source country. That is its position vis-a-vis other source countries that we have. And a first-hand indicator of that position, relative position, is the share of China in our total imports from the world. This is the aggregate level scenario. So if we look the four curves, which are all upward rising, look at the lowest curve. This indicates share of China in our total imports from the world, and that is around 15% during 2015-2018. But if we look at the import of machinery and transport equipment, China has been supplying almost 40% of our total requirement of machinery and transport equipment during 2017-18, that period. Followed by, if you look at this green curve, that's the chemicals. So China is supplying more than 25% of our requirement of chemicals from the world. And if we look at the medicinal and pharmaceutical products, similar trends. So basically, China is supplying more than what we are getting from Germany, UK, and USA together. A similar trend can be observed for the organic chemicals. Now, organic chemicals are very important because those are the components for the drugs and medicines that we produce. And if we look, so there is no match with China. China has been supplying during the last 3-4 years more than 35% of our requirement of organic chemicals. In 1995, we imported 15% of our requirement from United States. in contrast to only 7% from China. But in 2017, 35% of our requirement is met from China. And this is the share of China in total imports of telecommunication and sound recording apparatus. The same picture. China is emerging as a major supplier since the year 2003-2004. The interesting observation is that during 2011 and 2015, the blue curve, which shows the imports from UK. No, I think this is from Korea. So this should be Korea. During 2011 to 2015, imports from South Korea went hand in hand with that from China. But thereafter, share of Korea along with that of Germany, Japan, UK and USA declined steadily. And China's share jumped 3% in 2007 and remained at that level thereafter. And this is a similar trend for office and data processing machines, electrical machinery, parts and components. Again, for parts and components, during the initial years of my study, that is from 1995 till 2001-2, it was UK and USA who had been the major supplier, supplying 35 to 40% of our requirements. But thereafter, it is again all China, going up to more than 50% in the year 2017. Now, to sum up, China's share in India's total import of all important categories of products and components has increased steeply since 2004-2005. In 2018, 40% of import of organic chemicals came from China. This underlies dependence of Indian drug and pharma companies on China for intermediates and components for production of drugs and pharmaceutical products. Since 2007, 40 to 50% of total imports of parts and components for electrical and electronic goods have been sourced from China. Heavy dependence on China can also be observed in electrical machinery and telecom and sound recording apparatus. The largest beneficiaries of all these imports are Indian pharmaceutical sector, automobile sector, and the telecom network sector. In fact, according to SIAM, the Association of Automobile Companies, many critical parts related to the new emission norms like Bharat Stage 6 and of electric vehicles come from China. So this leads us to a question, the important question that what may be the plausible causes for China emerging as the major source country for manufacturing imports? Is it due to fundamentals and market-driven process like cost, which depends on technology, factor abundance and cheap labor, and quality, which depends on technology? Or is it trade policy induced? For example, India's unilateral tariff and non-tariff barrier policies, bilateral policies, and the like. Let me start with India's trade liberalization policy. There is no doubt that since 2001, as per the WTO requirements, India have reduced its unilateral tariffs and non-tariff barriers quite significantly. And this may have indeed caused a manifold increase in imports from China. But this alone cannot explain why China's importance has increased vis-a-vis relative to other traditional major source countries. Unilateral reductions and rationalization of tariffs and non-tariff barriers should have benefited all these source countries more or less equally, which did not happen. So the issue then is it the bilateralism or regionalism as a candidate? Not either, because India doesn't have any bilateral treaty like PTA or FTA in force with China. The Look East policy introduced by the P.V. Narasimha Rao government in 1991 focused on ASEAN countries instead of China. The scope of this Look East policy was expanded in the year 2003 to include China, Japan, and Korea. But interestingly, the Look East policy and its subsequent expansion led to FTAs being signed with ASEAN in 2010 for goods and in 2015 for services, Korea in 2010 for goods and services, and Japan in 2011 goods and services, but no such PTA and FTA with China so far. Thus, India's bilateral and regional trade policies in Southeast and East Asia should have put ASEAN countries, Japan and Korea, in an advantageous position vis-a-vis China and Western countries, instead of putting China in an advantageous position. But that didn't happen as well. So all this may imply that market-determined forces, cost and quality competitiveness of Chinese goods, may be plausible candidates for its increasing dominance for our import requirements. Transport costs may also have favored imports from China because of its geographical proximity with India. Now, Chinese manufacturing goods are cost competitive, no doubt, and in many instances, their cost of production are far below that of many East Asian and European countries. Of course, there are issues of dumping, as Professor Martin was talking about, but on the large, two other factors that contributed is the low wage cost and large-scale production enabling China to exploit economies of scale. In many instances, the competing European economies operate on a much smaller scale compared to China, rendering them being unable to exploit economies of scale. China does have the technology as well. Cheaper but equally efficient 4G and 5G telecom network developed by Chinese companies is just one among many such examples. All these have led China to emerge as the factory of the world. The next question that crops up, is it cheaper, low quality manufacturing good that has led to its dominance in low and middle income countries like India? Now, unfortunately, the data that IMF provides on quality indices of goods produced by a host of countries, I have taken the China and India examples from that particular study. That data does not subscribe to this low quality myth. I have chosen three product categories. One is the chemical elements and compounds, then machinery other than electric, and electrical machinery for China and for India. And these top three steeply rising curves indicate how the quality index of these goods are changing, the goods that China are producing. And the highest quality index is that of machinery other than electric. And this yellow one, the orange one is the chemical elements and compounds. Compared to these three, India is lagging much below, lagging behind in terms of its quality. Now, if we compare the Chinese quality relative to the United States, this is so basically if we take the US quality as one, then what would be the Chinese quality? And all these three quality indices are rising, implying that quality gap between Chinese and American goods has been narrowing down. The next issue then, is it the low skill, low technology intensive manufacturing goods that has led to its dominance, China's dominance in countries like India? So I present the skill composition of Chinese manufacturing exports, and this is the overall manufacturing exports of China to India. This curve, steeply rising curve, is the high skill manufacturing exports by China to India. This is the medium scale, and that's the low scale. So we are importing a lot of high skill intensive manufacturing goods from China. And if we compare what we are importing from the world as a whole, and what is the share of China and the United States in such high skill intensive manufacturing and medium scale, there also China is far ahead of the United States. We are importing almost 55% of our requirement of high skill intensive manufacturing from China, compared to less than 5% from the United States. And if we look at the parts and components, again, the skill composition is in favor of China. So in parts and components, these blue segments indicate the high skill components, and that is around 94 to 96%. For Japan, it is below 80%. United States, it is between 80 to 90%. And for Germany, it is even lower. It is below 60%, roughly around 55% in the last 1 decade. So, in such a context, what are we going to gain from boycotting Chinese goods? Certainly, security concerns involving many apps and telecom network facility is a major issue and must be given utmost importance. There is no doubt about that. But does that call for an across-the-board boycott? That's the issue. Or is it a wave of protectionism in the disguise, riding on the sentiments of millions of Indian consumers? When WTO mandate and principles prohibit use of tariff and non-tariff barriers, except as anti-dumping duties or countervailing measures, is it that the policymakers and domestic industrial lobby are trying to ride on patriotic feelings and boycott slogans and emotions? If that be the case, then the question is, what costs do we have to bear due to such boycotts? Government of India is also reconsidering expansion of the set of goods and components under import licensing, particularly for those goods and components coming from China. But here we have to be careful, because stricter import licensing regime should not take us back to the evils of license raj and the corruption and dupe lobbying activities that it led to during the 1970s and 1980s. As far as self-reliance is concerned, it sounds good. But it is a long-term policy and should be based on domestic industries becoming cost and quality competitive, as Professor Majid was also talking about, and for which stepping up R&D expenditure and other policies are needed. We cannot achieve self-reliance overnight by boycotting Chinese goods or restricting imports of Chinese goods. In our long history of protectionism, the idea of attaining economies of scale through infant industry protection did not work. It did not encourage innovations either. If it had, then India would have emerged as exporter of technology-intensive manufacturing goods and exporters of parts and components, instead of depending heavily on imports of such goods. And if we look at the R&D expenditure as a share of GDP spent by India and China, India is nowhere in comparison with China. Over the years from 1996 to 2018, we could not even cross the 1% mark, whereas China, from 0.5% of its GDP in 1996, increased the R&D expenditure to over 2%. And we should keep in mind that in purchasing power parity terms, China's GDP in 2019 was roughly 2.3 times that of India. So the scale and the magnitude of the R&D expenditure that China is putting is huge, is understandable if we multiply that little over 2% and compare that with the 2.3 times of GDP that China has with respect to vis-a-vis India. Now, returning growth, that's another question. Of course, increased dependence on China for intermediates and parts and components means that call for boycott of Chinese goods and consequent fall in imports may jeopardize growth unless economic ties with other countries are strengthened. So where do we stand here? First of all, it is undeniable that we do not have the capacity as well as capability to produce critical parts and components for sectors like pharmaceutical, telecom, electronics, and automobiles to replace imports from China. So without finding out alternative source countries for basic components for drugs and pharma products, can we still maintain our comparative advantage as largest producers of vaccines that we are hearing so much nowadays, and producer of cheaper generic drugs, and therefore maintain our enviable position as pharmacy of the third world? Is very doubtful, because if we can remember, I was showing you the huge percentage share of China in our organic chemical imports from the world. Automobile is another sector that will be badly hit, which relies heavily on imports of critical parts of engines, as I had mentioned earlier, required to comply with higher emission standards. And this will have serious implications for protecting our environment. Now, if we look at the FDI from China, I will be very brief on this. This is an RBI data. China is much in the lower rank compared to, I'm not talking about Mauritius, but compared to Singapore, the Netherlands, USA, Japan, Germany. So lots of FDI come from these countries compared to only $50 million that we had from China in 2017. The Indian official estimates of cumulative FDI from China over the last 20 years is roughly $2.4 billion, of which $1 billion is estimated to be invested in automobile sector, followed by electrical equipments and electronics. Now, according to Chinese Ministry of Commerce, by the end of 2017, Chinese investment had been to the tune of $8 billion. But even then, annual flow as well as cumulative FDI from China still remains far below those coming from USA and the other countries. So it might appear that loss of FDI, if we really stall those FDIs from China, may not jeopardize growth to the same extent as loss of imports of parts and components may have. But the actual future scenario may be altogether different. According to a Brookings India study by Krishnan in March 2020, current Chinese investments, including planned investment, is at least $26 billion, much higher than the official estimates. Investment plans to the tune of $15 billion in several infrastructure projects are yet to be approved. All these add up to a significantly large FDI from China, and debarring planned Chinese investment of such a magnitude can have a major adverse impact on growth of the Indian economy. And therefore, the government of India must act judiciously regarding potential Chinese investments that can add value to the Indian economy and accelerate growth without compromising on national security. So I'll be concluding within a few slides by making some remarks. So why since 2005 there has been a surge in imports from China, replacing traditional major source country, will require further comprehensive empirical analysis. But cost competitiveness of Chinese products will be a major explanation anyway. The crux of the matter is undeniable dependence on China, which may be difficult to reduce in the short run. Existing trends suggest that trade with Japan, Korea, Singapore, and other Asian countries, and with Western countries like UK, USA, and EU, have to be increased manifold to even match with what we have been importing from China. However, no single East Asian country has the productive capacity to emerge as a single major potential cheaper source to replace China. On the other hand, FTA talks with the EU being stalled after long years of negotiation, and FTA talk with the United States not progressing much, increased trade with West is not likely as well in the short run. Having said that, efforts must be increased manifold in trade negotiations with all these countries if we are to reduce our dependence on China for our import requirements in the long run. We have to make better use of the existing FTAs with Japan, Korea, and ASEAN by broadening scope of such FTAs and diverting some of our imports from China to these nations. We also have to restart FTA negotiations with the EU, as that would give a lot of advantage to India in the present situation. I can give two examples. First, many parts and components crucial for production of manufacturing goods can be imported from the EU. And most importantly, 5G telecom networks can be obtained from European companies at competitive rate. But lots of challenges lie in restarting FTA negotiations with the European Union. The India-EU negotiations of FTA started in the year 2007 and were called off in 2013 over a number of issues, including, first, India's unwillingness to provide market access to automobiles and wines and spirits, and second, India's unwillingness to open up financial services like banking, insurance, and e-commerce. EU also wanted to include issues related to labor standards and environmental standards in the FTA talk, which India had always objected to. It is understandable, and recently the EU authorities have already made it clear, unless these basic issues are resolved, FTA negotiations cannot restart. Due to similar bone of contention regarding linking non-trade issues with trade issues, the FTA talk with USA has not progressed much so far. So basically, the FTA front with the Western countries like the European Union and United States, at least in the short run, doesn't give us a very rosy picture. Finally, we can expect some retaliation from China. Geopolitical or military? It is often argued that the current border crisis, this is one of the arguments. The current border crisis is a fallout of India coming out of regional comprehensive economic partnership in November 2019, involving China, ASEAN countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. RCEP was intended to facilitate China's dream project, Belt and Road, which was earlier known as One Belt, One Road strategy. And India's coming out of this RCEP dealt a severe blow to that project. India's recent review of economic relationship with China may similarly lead to further border conflict as part of China's strategy to keep India under pressure. We can also expect some economic retaliation, as obvious. China will certainly be aggressive in suing Indian telecom companies for cancelling 4G contract and put all pressure it can do to market its 5G network. If hefty fines are imposed on Indian telecom industry for reneging the 4G contract, then it will impose a huge financial burden on the economy. Let me end by giving a cartoon figure which one of my students had given me just before the webinar, and I thought that this epitomizes what I was saying. So instead of saying anything, I could have just posted this cartoon and that's all. But I know that Shoma would have been a little bit disappointed in that. But this, I think, tells us all about the future of sanction and boycotts and the economic ties. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you, sir. We are very much thankful to you for your valuable lecture backed by analytical and other statistical data. And we think that we have been enriched and clear our conclusions regarding India-China trade relations and its future. So thank you very much, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Now
I finished off a little bit earlier so that we can have some time for discussions and questions.
Now there is a questionnaire session which will be conducted by Dr. Uttam Haldar. I think there are many queries or questions already came to our conductor, Dr. Uttam Haldar, from our audience. Now, Uttam, you may start
the questionnaire session.
Yes, madam. The first question is about Subhato Maji sir. Sayan Kumar Rai asked, there is a question, why international institutions like WTO do not take necessary action against China for violating the dumping rule? Hello, sir, I am audible. Hello? Hello?
Hello, you are audible. Uttam, you are audible. Hello.
Yeah,
So why international institutions like WTO do not take necessary action against China for violating the dumping law?
uh, yes, I can understand the question. I can understand the question. Um, See, the trade conflict between India and China is not to do with the anti-dumping laws. Anti-dumping laws are such that you would always find some countries are protesting against the other countries and they are in a conflict in WTO. But China-US conflict with the anti-dumping things that started way back in maybe early 80s or something like that. That did not continue till 2000. I do not know, but it is anti-dumping disputes are mostly disputes between China and the developed countries, USA and Europe. I don't think that Rajat might actually add, but I don't think that the anti-dumping thing is an issue in India, because in India these industries don't exist. So
Exactly.
what happens is that if you have an industry and China is dumping here, so that the industry is suffering, there can be anti-dumping suit. But as Rajat has pointed out, that the manufacturing imports that and chemicals and so on, whatever, those are all manufacturing imports that we import from China. We don't have imports. So it means that either these industries just do not exist, or these industries cannot, our prices just cannot match. So both ways, whether China is selling at a lower price, little lower price, or little higher price, India should not care, because India needs this. For example, take pharmaceutical industry, in the automobile component industry, the electronics, electrical goods industry. See, if Chinese switches, Chinese lamps, if if they are selling, 10 rupees, 15 rupees less than the standard Indian products, and the Indians know that these goods will be very difficult to wipe out from the market, even if they are selling at 15 rupees, for example, or maybe little more. So that's why anti-dumping is not a very relevant thing for India. And mind you, as Rajat was pointing out, WTO has this MFN clause. When China entered WTO, China got this MFN benefit. That is, every country is the most favored nation. So that's why very difficult these days actually to impose a tariff or impose something which the WTO will actually see as a rate of protection, and they will say this is discriminatory, because you are not imposing the same tariffs to all countries they are exporting to your country. So this MFN, and whenever China was allowed to enter WTO, and if you follow history, there were lots of issues whether the China would be allowed to enter WTO and so on. But once it has entered WTO, it has cornered most of the countries in the world. So, you cannot deny the fact that China is better in selling goods, in making goods, and so on. The question is that, can you remain indifferent to it? That is, can you remain indifferent to the fact that we are not producing anything? We are not a manufacturing country. Should we remain indifferent to this kind of specialization? And our answer, and I think, as any economist would argue, that our answer is no. Because you have to employ people in this country, the semi-skilled, relatively unskilled, and medium-skilled workers. If you do not have industries and you have only the app-based industries, you cannot actually employ these people. So this is very important from India's point of view, that not only about cutting back Chinese imports, but being good in exports to all countries, to be efficient in manufacturing so that you create employment opportunities and you produce goods which are globally competitive. So that is the problem that I feel. I have been seeing, just a second, I have been seeing some remarks on the chats regarding labor laws. It's a very interesting question, and I think both Rajat and I did not actually deliver much on the labor laws,
Right,
which
right.
issue in
True.
India and China, because I think this is a key issue. You know, one point that I was trying to tell you, China is more productive than India. That's exactly what Rajat has shown in terms of the imports and products that we import from China and their quality and so on. You cannot deny that China is more productive than India. Because why? Because China's GDP is 2.3% more. So let's say if you forget about distribution of GDP, the per capita income, I think it's more than twice, more than twice. It's from 700 or 800 PPP.
2.1 times. 2.1 times.
2.1 times PPP.
In PPP, yeah.
Okay. So if this is the case, then if I'm paying you an average double the wage rate,
Yeah.
and still you are producing things which are cheaper. Well, it can
Yes.
happen with big economies of scale, as Rajat
Yeah.
has said, that larger economies of scale will reduce your average cost of production. But mind you, that one has to know that if India gives them a big market, China will invest in a way that those market will reduce the cost. So it may not
Right.
be that the Chinese costs are low as such, but if they get Indian market, they can actually sell at a lower cost. So that is possible. But the problem with labor laws in China is really serious. And this, people say that when you are a teacher for 10 years, then you want to show to students how much you know and you have researched. Then actually, when you go between teaching 10 years to 20 years or 25 years, you already got bored by teaching so much. You actually want to cut back, your amount of, imparting of knowledge. But once you are almost there at your retirement age, you have this threat, maybe after a few years, no one would listen to you. So therefore, that the early thing will come up. So it's like an U-shaped tendency to give you knowledge or to give you excess knowledge, like in excess demand situation.
Right.
So I'm giving this excess knowledge to you that in India, labor is a problem. If you really talk about labor abundance and the cost of labor, those two things do not match in India. And they don't match if you in relative terms, if you consider in China. And I will tell you one, not story, one phenomenon, event which everyone would agree. That is, in China, the laborers cannot agitate. That's pure and simple. Whatever the government or the farm or the company or the whatever public sector decides, that has to be there. And China ruthlessly implement these labor laws, as they call it, laws. And I will tell you one story. A friend of mine used to get things from China. He's a businessman. And well, he is not only a businessman, but he represents a very big company of India also. What happens was that once he told me, which may be wrong, I do not know whether it is kind of a cooked up story, but to avoid wasting time when workers are working, China would actually use adult diapers so that the workers do not waste time by going to toilets.
Wow.
And nobody says this because this is not really, but there have been umpteen number of write-ups in American magazines and so on. You could see that the coercive nature of Chinese system, that I cannot blame China for that, because China is not India. It's not democracy. So it means that if I say after 10 hours I have to do this, after 8 hours I have to do this, I have to give workers this, I have to give worker that. The point is that China says, I'll give you much higher wage, but for 12 hours you have to work without any question asked. So, and the questions are that India is incapable of doing that. Sometimes the industrialists make a heavy weather of that, which is not true. Indians The industrialists often, industrialists, many of them often try to pay as little as possible and make you work as hard as possible. So I'm not talking anything about the trade union labor movement, but in a democratic country, this is very natural that we would be aware of our rights. There will be organizations which can go to the court of law. We can have some sort of a liberal and constitutional legal provisions. But all of this work towards increasing cost or increasing gestation period or increasing some sort of production time or resolution time. So if you go to China, the laborers cannot agitate. So a guy can be very happy because he said, no, here if I pay them little more that they won't do, they would like to have more and so on. So all these are very important so far that cost calculation is concerned. So a dose of democracy is there, and this is a democracy that we are proud of. There is, please make no mistake, that democracies can give you bad things or good things, but to live like a democrat in your country, to be aware of what is democratic right and freedom, is something like water and air. You can criticize them, you cannot live without them. So that way, this is a deeper issue. We cannot deny that is the case. Apparently, yes, the labor laws are much more stringent in India, or the laborers are much more firefighters here, but they are not in China. And so this must have something to, must have led to some sort of advantage. So this is a question that I think that has to be researched. And I think Rajat may have some more points on this.
Yeah, I will add 2 points. First is that the cost of living in China is going up. And so there is an internal pressure for wages to be revised upward. So down the lines 4 or 5 years, China may not have the advantage of low wage country anymore, because the rate at which the per capita GDP is rising and the resentments and recently I have the opportunity of reading a thesis by a Stanford PhD student. He was a Chinese guy as well. I mean, he was talking how the political autocracy in China, they are retaining autocracy by giving away few things to the mass so that they don't revolt. And part of this giving out may be a higher wage revision. So in that case, as Shugotada was saying, they will have to ride on technological innovation and economies of scale. And for that, they need a bigger market like India and other countries. Even the small European countries cannot provide that kind of big market like what India can offer. But at the same time, I would fully agree with Shugotada that whatever growth in the last 10, 15 years we have seen is driven by services, primarily the financial services, software services. But once that boom is going to burst, and particularly post-COVID, there will be a huge dent on IT-enabled services may also get a hit. In that scenario, if we cannot build up our manufacturing base, then we cannot expect to step up our growth to the same extent as we had pre-COVID in next 5 to 6 years. I believe that during the protectionist regime prior to 1990, we didn't make well use of that. We encouraged many lobbies to remain infancy stage in their, the infant industries remained in their infancy stage. And we didn't use any whip. So we allowed them to remain infant and take advantage of all the protective work. Never allowed that. I mean, given the autocratic regime, of course, I fully agree with Shugotada that democracy is like water and air. We should breathe and we should have. So this reminds me of that diamond water paradox. Water is priceless, but that is the most important thing. And for diamond, we can live even without diamond, but we pay so much high price. So as long as there is abundant water and air, we don't value them. So it's democracy is like that. But at the same time, there are issues that was Ashutosh Varshney and others were talking, they were floating the idea of democratic middle way back in 2002. and the democracy, the evil of the democracy is that you cannot attain the height of China, South Korea, Taiwan, etc. But at the same time, you don't go down what we have seen in the sub-Saharan African countries. So we are stuck in the middle, which is good as well as bad. But at the same time, something must be done, and for that, if we really want to make ourselves self-reliant, there is nothing wrong in claiming that, but that's a long-term policy, and we should be really have a real brainstorming to how to do that. But first thing that we have to keep up or raise our investments, R&D, innovation to a much, much higher level. Until then, we have to really look forward to the imports so that in the short run, our manufacturing growth is not jeopardized. Any other question? Hello?
Hello.
Yes, sir. Professor Konaktanti Bauji asks that as far as my knowledge goes, China has trade surplus with all its trading partners. How that has been possible?
Can you repeat?
As far as my knowledge goes, China has trade surplus with all its trading partners. How that has been possible?
I think that is the biggest question. But one way to answer this is that China may be more cost competitive that I was talking about, or whatever may be the reason. Most cost competitive. It is a very large manufacturing base, and you see, China is attracting quite a lot of outsourcing, and its presence in the global value chain is huge. And as I had pointed out, it has turned out to be the factory of the world. Even when I visited, there was a dollar shop. Shubhatra must be knowing that, a dollar shop. So if you step into that shop, whatever you buy, everything is $1. You pick up anything, and just on the back side, you see made in China. Having a good which is made in China, and I'm paying $1. So that was in 1997, 98, and it is 2020. So of course, China has been able to widen its manufacturing base. It has become very competitive in manufacturing goods, and that may be one reason why China is having trade surplus with, even I think with the United States, China is having a trade surplus. It's not just India, even with the United States. So that's a big surprise, but that's true, that's fact. So we can't deny this.
So next question, India is also a labor-abundant country. So if India actually invests in labor-intensive manufacturing, would not help in boosting the GDP and ensure sustainable development?
That's a good question, and a question that has been put forward by many in recent times. You see, when we say India will invest, who is India? Either the government invests or the private sector invests. The point is that if the technology that is globally available is highly automated, highly capital intensive, highly machine intensive, and that is very cost effective. Like, for example, the example I give these days is the cement factories. There was a time when we say that we build up a cement factory means you're employing a lot of people. But today, a modern cement factory which produces tons of cements employs not more than 5 people, because the entire thing is automated. So the question is that as an investor, as an entrepreneur, if I'm investing in a cement industry, I'm not really investing in a labor intensive industry. But in India, if you go and look at the near Calcutta cement plants, there are cement plants like that right in West Bengal also. So the question is that if it is more profitable for me not to employ a single individual, I will not employ. Similarly, the issue then therefore is that when can I increase the demand for labor when the automated machines are coming and people are, you know, investing in inappropriate technology. The government has a big role to play in terms of pumping up research and development so that indigenous technologies can be promoted, but with a very good scientific and technological basis. And to make sure that places, that those sectors where the labor workers are capable of doing work, those sectors are also invested in. That means that how to increase the profitability of labor intensive goods. Because if you cannot increase the profitability of labor intensive goods, India just cannot go and just pump in investments. The government can invest. I completely agree with anybody which might say that there is a reason that the government invested in public sector companies. Some of them did not do well. There were many of them who were running in losses. But the fact is, overall atmosphere of public sector industrialization has helped India in its progress. So Jawaharlal Nehru's policy, whatever we criticize or wherever we criticize his policies, today whatever science and technology that we see in this country, whatever to what extent it has flourished, a large part of it has been contributed by big public sector enterprises, because their enterprises used to hire engineers, all these big public sector companies. So I am saying that labor intensive industries have to be profitable. The government has to have a look at the labor intensive industries. Government has to give a lot of impetus for research and development to increase the efficiency of the labor intensive industries. The labor intensive industries may not be the only answer. Entrepreneurship is an answer. So if there are small and medium enterprises with few entrepreneurs, there will be, small groups of employees. But if you pull them together, there is a large employment program. So all of these are proper policies. And of course, the government has to invest. But it is the government which has to decide how to do it, by noting that this is the most important defect of this country and the most urgent need at this hour, that we need modern technology, but we need to employ people. We need new technology from outside, but we need our own new technology. We need huge investment in R&D. So all of these have to be balanced, and the government should have a vision to think of 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now. Because if you don't think about, actually previously used to say that you are not a visionary if you are not thinking about 50 years. So I don't cross out anything. That is, I think the old concept of investment in labor intensive industries is very important, but it has to be profitable. You cannot sustain a labor intensive industry by pumping subsidies for all years to come. That is the billion-dollar question, that how can I make a labor intensive sector more profitable than it is today? And there the role of R&D to make it more efficient becomes very important to create. And from the demand side, the government would always have this responsibility, that make sure that the aggregate economy is run properly, so that there is no, there is no dearth of so-called effective demand. So these government has to understand and do this. And it's an important issue. I completely agree.
Now here, I would like to point out one thing, that I have been floating this for last 5 to 6 years, which I call development paradox. If you look at the structure and composition of or nature of export-led growth all over the world, studies which talk about that the countries which have grown very fast through export-led growth, exports, have been exporting the goods which are aligned with the world import pattern. And what are those goods? Those are skill intensive, technology intensive. If we look around, even our housemaids, they are more, I mean, inclined to buy touchscreen mobile phones, and the money, the percentage of labor intensive. So basically, if we, that's a development paradox. We need to protect the interest of the unskilled labor, because that kind of export-led growth will only lead to inequality and loss of employment for the unskilled workers. But at the same time, in order to grow, you cannot have an export pattern which is biased in favor of unskilled labor intensive goods, because world is not demanding that. So in order to grow, you have to make your export biased towards the skill intensive and high technology intensive goods. That must be distributed properly, and what Sugato was saying is kind of distribute gains among the unskilled workers. But it is very difficult that in this era of globalization, we can grow, we can maintain faster growth depending heavily only on the, I think that might be a very difficult proposition.
So there is a question from Subram Supan. What is the reason for India's low quality preference imported from China? Is it due to huge demand from middle and low income group Indian? Shall we substitute those goods in India?
For whom the question is?
This is Sir Marjit sir.
Marjit sir. Okay. Sugato.
Hello, sir.
I think Rajat is an expert on quality issue. Let him answer this.
Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, sir. What is the reason for India's low quality preference imported from China?
Low quality preference imported from China is not a right thing. We do, as Sugato was telling, China can produce a whole range of qualities for the same good. We do import a lot of low quality goods at a lower price, but at the same time, we also import a lot of high quality goods from China. So I would say that on an average, we import more of low quality goods. Second point is that, see, there are two dimensions. When as a consumer, you go to buy a product, you look at two things. One is the price, other is the quality. Now, then your net utility might still go up and you can end up buying the low quality. So it's a question of, it's like the following thing. You see, when we travel by air, there is a business class and there is an economy class. There is a huge difference of quality between the business class service and the economy class service. But the price difference is even starker. Because if it had not been the case, then there would have been no buyer of the business class service. Everyone would have gone to the economy class service. So you have to price disparity and the quality disparity matched so that the net utility from a particular product, whether it is low quality or high quality, a consumer will be buying that particular quality which is targeted to her or him. So basically, there is no, I think when Sugato started saying, giving his lecture, he said that there is nothing wrong in buying low quality products if that is even cheaper. But for parts and components, that might be a big thing. But I am not sure that whether for parts and components, the quality is so low that we are going to buy, we are buying the low quality goods from China. Toys, yes. There are some consumer products, yes. But you see, the Mi products, we all are using the Xiaomi or Mi phones. They are cheaper. Definitely, if you go to the higher range of Samsung or Samsung mobile phones, like 30,000 or something, those are very good quality. But in the range of 8 or something, around 14,000, and Samsung is selling at 18,000. But Mi is providing much more features than Samsung. So everyone is buying a Mi rather than Samsung. So what is wrong in that?
Sir, is digitized and information revolution in our country will be affected adversely due to heavy reliance on China regarding IT-related products? Roger, sir.
Yeah, maybe because the 4G and 5G, as I was telling about, you see, in Asia, in China, Huawei, ZTT, there is another company, three companies, they have already, they are saying that they have manufactured 5G. Korean, the Samsung has had invested hugely in 5G. Perhaps they have also developed. Nokia, Ericsson, and there is a French company. They have also developed 5G. But all the 5G developed by the Chinese companies are much cheaper. Even Japan and United States were contemplating to buy 5G from the Chinese companies. But now the recent standoff and also the stance between Mr. Trump and the Prime Minister of China. I mean, China is, United States is also looking for non-Chinese manufacturing. But so a large chunk of non-European countries are looking for Chinese, were looking for Chinese 5G networks. Why? Must be cost competitive. So if we abandon the contract of 4G, that will be a great hit. We also have to look for other 5G companies, the European companies perhaps. But for that, the FTA negotiation is must. Otherwise, our telecom network and telecom services will be badly hit.
So, last question. Is it possible for India to pick and choose the product which is to be boycotted considering the WTO agreement? Misunderstanding. It is Roger, sir.
What?
Is it possible for India to pick and choose the product which is to be boycotted considering the WTO agreement?
Very difficult. I mean, you see, that's why I said that. Is it that we are riding on the sentiments of millions of Indian consumers of boycotting the product instead of erecting tariff and non-tariff barriers? We can't erect tariff and non-tariff barriers unless there is a solid ground of anti-dumping or countervailing measures that will go against WTO principles. So, but of course, we can block the investment in strategic sectors like that we have done for apps, for national security. We also can block in FDI in strategic sectors and of national importance. But overall, it is very difficult that we can erect tariff and non-tariff barriers on goods and services and parts and components because that will go against the WTO principles. So one has to be very careful, and we have to draw a balance between not inducing China to take us to dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. China can take us to the dispute settlement mechanism at body at WTO. So we must be careful about that. But one thing is very favorable for India due to the even the COVID-19 and many other issues. Geopolitically, in the political scenario, in the world politics also, China has drawn more enemies than friends. But that does not mean that India can take advantage by erecting tariffs and non-tariff barriers. That's a totally different ballgame altogether. Thank you.
It's all. Madam, our resource person, please speak.
This is the end of our question and answer session. Thank you, Dr. Uttam Hallar, for conducting this question and answer session. And now the vote of thanks will be given by our head of the department, Dr. Uttam Hallar.
It is my privilege to give vote of thanks of those directly and indirectly involved in the webinar to make it grand success. I am on behalf of the Department of Economics, Srirampur Girls College, would like to give heartfelt thanks to Dr. Sudipta Rai, Honorable President of our governing body, and MLA Srilampur, Government of West Bengal, and the Honorable Principal Ma'am, Dr. Soma Rai, for their continuous support. I express my special thanks to our honorable speakers, Professor Subhatam Archit and Professor Ayat Ajarjo, for enriching us with their informative and valuable speech. I extend my lot of thanks to Dr. Shantam Mukhopadhyay Talukdar, coordinator of IQAC, and all IQAC members for tremendous encouragement. I convey my gratitude to Dr. Bimal Mondal, Research Council Secretary for our college, for his wholehearted support in every aspect of the webinar. Thanks to Dr. Sampa Sarkar, convener of the webinar committee, and all the members of the webinar committee for designing a series of webinars. Many thanks to Dr. Sandeep Mojumdar and Mr. Devkanti Das for providing technical support. Special thanks to all of my colleagues and non-teaching staff of our college for their limitless support. I convey my heartiest thanks to all participants in the webinar to make it successful. Lastly, I have extended my heartfelt thanks to the chairperson of the webinar, Dr. Soma Rai, for smooth conducting of the webinar. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
স্যার আবার দেখা হবে স্যার।
Thank you very much.
সোমা কিছু বলছিলে?
বলছি পরে দেখা হবে ইউনিভার্সিটিতে।
সুগতদার সঙ্গে অনেকদিন বাদে দেখা হলো। আপনার গানগুলো শুনছি ইউটিউবে।
দেখা হবে, ফোনে কথা হবে। বাই।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
ওকে, বাই।
Okay.
Okay.
বাই।